Hello and welcome to Stand With Us TV Live. As you know, Stand With Us is working around the clock, supporting Israel and fighting anti-Semitism. Thank you for joining us. We have a great show for you today. Coming up, I'll be joined by statesman, well-known Israeli historian, author, and politician, and dear friend of Stand With Us, former Ambassador Michael Oren. And don't forget, if you love the work of Stand With Us, please support us at standwithus.com/donate. My guest today has served as a member of Knesset and deputy minister in the Prime Minister's office, where he has met with foreign leaders while also defending Israel in the media. He spearheaded efforts to strengthen Israel diaspora relations, to develop the Golan Heights, and to fight BDS. As chairman of a classified subcommittee in the Israeli government, he has dealt with some of Israel's most sensitive security issues. There is no doubt that this former Israeli ambassador to the U.S. has devoted his life to the state of Israel and the Jewish people. So welcome, Michael Oren. It is so great to see you. How are you doing?
Wonderful to be with you too, Roz.
How are you doing during this pandemic?
Well, for the last 2 days, I think very excitedly, I babysat for my grandkids, which is something we have not been able to do for many weeks, if not months. So we're beginning to crawl out of it. The levels are down significantly today, and a large segment of the population has been vaccinated. I'm close to 2 months after my second vaccination.
Fantastic, fantastic. That's Israel. Pretty efficient.
Very. On the vaccinations, yes, we have some issues with segments of our society who are not exactly cooperating with the government, not in social distancing, and not in getting vaccinated. And tonight, the news was that the health ministry may impose penalties on those people who refuse to be vaccinated.
Wow. We'll see how that goes. So we have thousands of people watching us right now, Michael, and many are curious about you from the very beginning. Can you tell us what led you to make the decision to make Aliyah?
Ooh. Well, I think ever since I was a very, very young person, I wanted to move to Israel. The assumption was that someday I'd move to Israel. A lot of it had to do with the area in which I grew up, the time and history in which I grew up. I grew up in a largely working class neighborhood. I was the only Jewish family in that neighborhood. I was the only Jewish kid in that neighborhood. Encountered a great deal of anti-Semitism. My father had fought in World War II along with his brother. They had liberated a concentration camp and taken photographs of the horrors they saw in this concentration camp. They kept these pictures in an album down the basement. Every time I'd come home all beat up from the anti-Semites, my father would take me down to the basement, open this album, and show me these pictures. And he'd say, you see this, son? This is why we need a strong Israel. By the way, I keep all those photographs in my cell phone. They go with me everywhere. I grew up during the period of the Six-Day War, and we look back on the Six-Day War today. We think about this spectacular victory. When I look back on the war, I don't think of the spectacular victory. I think about the 3 weeks that preceded that war, during which time Israel was completely isolated, surrounded by Arab armies on all sides. Nobody in the world was going to help Israel, including the United States. And we of my generation feel that the Jewish people are going to be witnessing a second Holocaust within a single generation. And yes, it was a miracle what happened on the seventh day that we woke up to. But that's not what we take with us. We take with us the trauma of the period of the Six-Day War. And after that, the Yom Kippur War of 1973, we realized that Israel's existence should not be taken for granted anytime. So from an early age, I wanted to move here. I was a little bit kooky. I used to work all year long, mowing lawns and shoveling snow and doing all sorts of odd jobs to save enough money to come here every summer and work for free in a kibbutz, which was great. I was a cowboy up on the Golan Heights, riding horses. I joined the Zionist Youth Movement. We went to Washington, D.C., as all good Zionist youth movements do. And there I met Israel's ambassador to the United States. I shook his hand. And at that point, I said, not only am I going to move to Israel, but I'm going to be Israel's ambassador to the United States. The ambassador's name was Yitzhak Rabin. I ended up later being an advisor to Yitzhak Rabin. until his tragic assassination. But eventually, throughout this whole entire period, I kept that vow. I wanted to be Israel's ambassador to the United States, and I eventually realized that dream.
That is amazing. I don't think I ever knew any of that. That is amazing. I'd love to see a picture of you on a horse. You have?
Hold on.
Oh my God.
This is the memoir, Ally, and I believe in Ally, there's a picture of me on a horse.
Oh
Let's
my
see.
God.
I don't know if you can see it. Let's see.
Oh my
There's me
goodness. Oh
on
my
a horse
goodness. There he
in the
is.
Golan Heights.
How old are you there?
18.
Amazing. Amazing.
18.
So it's
I
really
used to,
true.
I thought I used to call, I was a Jewish cowboy. I called myself Oi Rogers.
So you have had a multifaceted career, amazing career. Is there any particular highlights you'd like to talk about?
Well, so I would talk about, say, 4. How's that sound? Okay.
Okay.
Well, one was, of course, was being an historian and writing about the history of Israel in my books, the book about the 6-Day War, 6 Days of War, writing about America's involvement with the Middle East called Power, Faith, and Fantasy, writing that memoir, Ally, being a writer, writing about history, being a part of history, was deeply, deeply rewarding for me. I did my undergraduate and graduate work was in Middle Eastern history. And I was a student of Bernard Lewis at Princeton. And so these are the tools that I acquired as an historian, as an academician. And I was so fulfilling to be able to apply them to deepening our understanding of Israel's history, because it's really, to me, the most extraordinary story in history, not just in modern history, but in all of history, the creation and survival and thriving of this state. The next, of course, is the giving my credentials as Israel's ambassador to the United States to President Obama back in 2009, serving for almost 5 years during a most challenging period, perhaps the most challenging period in the U.S.-Israel relationship, and defending my state, defending the alliance, a source of profound fulfillment for me and pride. Not easy, but certainly deeply, deeply rewarding. Being sworn in as a member of Knesset, I ran for government. I was elected. I served 4 years in Knesset. I served as the deputy minister in the prime minister's office, working with Prime Minister Netanyahu in the field of foreign policy, representing Israel abroad to many, many countries, hosting foreign leaders in this country. It was endlessly fascinating, and I loved being a member of Knesset. I loved serving the Israeli people in a sort of very hands-on way. Really, that's most of what you do as a member of Knesset. You help people. And fulfilling also my other career, which is as a writer, as a creative writer. I can look back at this bookshelf, this conveniently placed bookshelf behind me. This is my most recent publication. It's a collection of short stories called The Night Archer and other stories. Get it in front of the camera. There you go. I've been a fiction writer almost all my life since I was 12, 13 years old, and published a series of novels. I have another novel coming out in May called To All Who Call in Truth, very Jewish novel. The short stories are something that I derive just immense satisfaction and enjoyment, and the book has been very well received, and I've been delighted by the reception. So for of my career, not my personal life, there's different stories, sources of great satisfaction and excitement and fulfillment.
So thank you for that. That was rich. Can we go to The Night Archer for a moment? And can you tell us what inspired you to write The Night Archer and all those short stories?
Well, again, this may be a long-winded answer, but it really starts when I was about 12, 13 years old. And I came home from school one day and I had a strange feeling, not the usual feeling you have when you're a 13-year-old boy. I had to write a poem, and I ended up writing my first poem. It was called Who Cries for the Soul of the Pigeon, rather depressing poem, later published in 17 magazine, believe it or not. And I began my career as a writer. I went on to write fiction. I wrote screenplays. A screenplay that I wrote when I was 17 won the National Young Filmmakers Award from PBS, Channel 13. which meant that I had to go to Hollywood. And I went to Hollywood for a while and worked as Orson Welles' assistant. And I probably would have stayed in Hollywood if I didn't have the Aliyah thing in my head that I had to go to Israel and be in the paratroopers. But I never stopped writing. And one of the great difficulties and challenges of being in public office in Israel and also in the United States, you should know, Roz, is that if you're in public office, you can write, but you can't publish. So a great number of these stories, and there are 51 of them here, were written during the period when I was certainly in Knesset, and I couldn't publish them. I had to wait to get out of Knesset to publish them. But they draw very heavily on my experiences. There are stories about war, because I've been in more than one. There's stories about diplomacy. There's stories about being in Hollywood, for example, about being a parent, being a son and a father and a husband. A lot of mystery stories, because I love mysteries, and a great number of stories about love.
So just for a moment, I want to say that we're being joined from people from all over the world, and I'd like to encourage everyone to please put your where you're viewing from in the comments section so we can acknowledge you as much as we can. But thank you for being with us today, and please continue writing us notes in the comments section. Michael, can we talk a little bit about the Abraham Accords? And as an Israeli, as a historian, as a writer, you probably have so many things to say.
I do indeed. I do indeed. The Abraham Accords. I first of all, just to put my cards on the table, I could probably say that with very few exceptions in Israel, I'm one of the few people who have accompanied the peace process, certainly vis-a-vis the Palestinians since its inception. I mentioned earlier that I had been an advisor to Yitzhak Rabin during the Oslo period. I had serious reservations about the Oslo Accords. I felt that we had to give it the best chance we had, the best opportunity, best effort we had, so we could look our kids in the eye and say that we tried. And I can look my kids in their eyes before they went off to the army, before they went off to war, and say that we tried. But all the way through the various peace process, advising to Israeli prime ministers, advising also American presidents. I participated in the last round of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Now it's already more than 10 years ago. And I was an advisor on the Trump peace plan as well. And I can say without reservations, for all the criticism of that peace plan, it was a plan that most accurately reflected realities on the ground. It actually had a chance of implementation, because the other peace process plans were completely devoid of that. The Abraham Accords come along and completely overturn a generation of assumptions about how you make peace between Israel and the Arabs. The assumption usually could be subsumed under one word. It was called linkage. And that is that the Arab-Israeli conflict was the core conflict in the Middle East. If you solve that conflict, you solve all the other conflicts in the Middle East between Shiites and Sunnis, Iranians and Iraqis, the Syrian civil war, the Yemen civil war, the Lebanon civil war. You solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, everything's going to be okay. And the core of the Arab-Israeli conflict was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the core of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the settlements, Israeli settlements in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, Israeli building of neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. And if you created a Palestinian state, if Israel withdrew to the 67 borders, if you redivided Jerusalem, if you uprooted tens of thousands of Israeli settlers, you could have Israeli-Palestinian peace, you'd have Israeli-Arab peace, and you'd have peace in the Middle East. I can't tell you, Roz, how many institutions and foundations they are for Middle Eastern peace, which are not about Middle Eastern peace. They're about Israeli-Palestinian peace, based on this notion of linkage. And along come the Abraham Accords and completely overturn all of these assumptions. And it's assumptions held by a vast peace industry, which includes not only these foundations, but most of the Western media, almost all of Western academia. These are doctrinaire ideas. It's a religion. And they were completely dispelled because the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco made peace with Israel without creating a Palestinian state, without redividing Jerusalem, without uprooting tens of thousands of settlers, without an Israeli withdrawal to the 1967 borders. It was all wrong. And the Abraham Accords are significant for another and no less momentous reason. The other assumption of the peace industry was that first you make peace between Israel and an Arab country, and then later those relationships would become normalized. So the normalization would flow from peace. So what you have in these relationships is, first of all, you have normalization. We have peace not between governments, as in the case in the peace treaties of Jordan and Israel and Egypt and Israel, because we don't have peace between the Egyptian people and Israelis. We don't have peace between the Jordanian people and Israelis, only between the governments. But with the UAE and Bahrain, we have peace between peoples. And we have normalization first, and peace will flow from that. So again, all these assumptions have been completely overthrown. What can I say? Thank God, it's about time. Only took about 50 years. And I sincerely believe that any future peace agreements between Israel and any Arab country will be according to the paradigm of the Abraham Accords, and not of the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt, certainly not the Oslo Accords, certainly not the Israel-Jordanian Treaty. Those will be the exceptions and not the rule.
It's pretty amazing. So what's the sense in the street for Israelis? I mean, is it like excitement? Is it skepticism? What does it feel like on the street?
I think it feels good. I think there's a contentment. To speak frankly, Israelis are so consumed with what is going on with the corona crisis. And it's not just the lockdown and the parents who have been locked down with their kids for such a long period of time. Close to 900,000 Israelis out of work. The tremendous economic upheaval here from corona, which continues, some of the political divisions that have been widened and deepened as a result of corona. That is what Israelis are thinking about right now. To tell you the truth, there's an election going on now. It's like our fourth election in 3 years? In 4 years, people aren't very focused on the election even. There's a tremendous sense of fatigue here.
I can only imagine, because we're going through the same thing. So we join you in that. We do worry about you, but here we're experiencing it on our own skin as well. I want to take a moment and thank you. We have a long history with you. Actually, we met at the beginning of Stand With Us.
2001.
I don't know if I ever gave you this general thank you for inspiring our young people, for inspiring our Israeli fellows, for coming and speaking to so many of our groups and just really making them, open their eyes in so many ways and really inspire them, like you were inspired, like you explained how you were inspired as a kid. It's the same thing. And so thank you. Thank you for speaking to so many of our audiences. Really appreciate that. And now I want to take you on a journey that, I mean, we can both laugh. We can laugh about now. But I want to take you back to UC Irvine.
Oh, boy.
Oh, boy. In 2010, when poor Michael Oren was standing on the stage, prepared to make a speech that was meant to go to, I think there were 500 or 600 people at least in the audience. And among them were students, probably about 30 of them, that were going to create chaos in the moment and not allow you to speak. It was I think it was February the 10th, 2010. And it was, wow, it was so crazy. I had never seen anything like that. I was there with you. I was on the ground. You and I were texting back and forth. Tell me what it felt like to be on that stage, and tell the audience anything else you want to tell them about that night.
Oh, I got a great backstory to that night. So we came into the building in Irvine, and it was the Student Muslim Population Organization. And they held first of all, they did a very provocative prayer at the entrance of the hall, which intimidated a great number of people, I must say, not us. And when we came into the hall, we became very aware that the members of this student Muslim organization had positioned themselves in such a way in the rows that the minute I spoke, one would stand up and start calling. By the time the security personnel got that person out of the row and I restarted my speech, another person would pop up in the middle of another row. And so it would go on. And it turned out this was the first time this tactic was used. It later became a very common tactic. And security personnel at UC Irvine were completely nonplussed. They didn't know how to deal with it in any way. And it started to get very violent. And finally, we called a pause. We went off the stage. The poor president of the university was shaking, literally shaking. It was nothing like this had ever happened. And the chief of police, the local chief of police, was there. And I turned around to him and I said, "Let me ask you a question, a legal question. Can you arrest them for disturbing the peace?" And he says, "Yeah, I can arrest them." And I said, "Okay, well, let's go back out." So we went back out. And it's interesting that the anti-Israel organizations always cut off the video at the point where I leave, and they never show when I come back. And we did come back, and I finished the speech. And furthermore, I said that, the whole thing was tragic because I had come to the campus not to speak to people who agreed with me, but people who disagreed with me. And that this was the United States of America, it wasn't Tehran. And that and I'd be willing to answer any questions if they just would sit and listen to the end. But of course, they weren't interested, and they kept on popping up and calling me a war criminal. And to the immense credit of this chief of police, these youngsters were arrested. And they later were known as the Irvine 11.
Correct.
And they were found guilty.
Correct.
And they were found guilty on appeal. And it became a landmark case. Because it turns out that not only do they have a freedom of speech, but so do I. And it turns out that not only does everyone have freedom of speech, they also have a freedom to listen, be able to listen to a speaker. And they were denying that freedom to the students of Irvine. And that's what the court determined. And that has remained a landmark determination.
So, by the way, they were sentenced to 50 to 100 hours. I think in the end, they had 100 hours of community service, each one of the 11. And at first, they were going to be suspended for a year, but they then modified it and they were suspended, I believe, for one semester. But it was a landmark case. It was watershed, I thought. And you were in the middle of it. We were all in the audience and feeling, oh my God, so bad for you having to be up there and start your speech over literally 11 or 12 times to get through it. But what you said to the kids, to everybody at the end, when they all marched out together, whoever was left that wasn't arrested, exactly what you just said, that I wish they would have stayed. I would have answered any questions. They're the ones who need to hear me. And that was inspirational.
I've had tougher times. I've had tougher ones. At University of Texas was tougher.
Really?
Yeah. It was tougher. They assaulted the stage, and there was a moment where the university itself violated its regulations. They explained to me that under University of Texas regulations, students have a right to stand up and shout 3 times and interrupt the speaker. But on the 4th time, they'd be taken out. And they stood up 3 times, and they stood up a 4th and 5th time. No one did anything. And about the 6th or 7th time, they basically assaulted the stage. And my great fear, and you must keep in mind, Roz, I don't want to sound like, G.I. Joe here, but I've been through a lot of tougher situations on the battlefield. Okay. So it was never a chance, never a feeling of being physically threatened in any way, or physically, I wasn't afraid for myself physically. Here, I was deeply panic stricken. Not for me. I was panic stricken for the pro-Palestinian students, because I was surrounded by not only my own security guard personnel, but by Secret Service, because I had been the target of an attempted Iranian assassination. That was the only time I had Secret Service agents around me. And these individuals are trained not to dissuade people who come at the person they're protecting. They're trained to take them down. And I was deeply afraid that one of these students would have been grievously injured or worse. And when I got off the stage, I got a hold of the dean of that school and gave her an earful. And I told her that if someone had been hurt, one of these protesters had been hurt, and it had gone to trial, that I'd be the first witness against the university.
Wow. There's a fine line between protecting you and life and limb, and then making sure that these kids don't get hurt too for their ideas.
So it's strange, but I was defending them against the negligence of the university.
What would you have wanted to see in that case? What would you have rather seen?
Well, if they were abiding by university regulations, they could have shouted me 3 times and then left.
But what
or
if
have been escorted out, or they've been escorted out. Still, it would have been sad. The same sadness with I had come to interact with those students. And by the way, the next night after Irvine, I spoke at Davis, and in that setting, there were people from the Students for Justice for Palestine, other Muslim students who came to protest, but they actually sat and listened. And they asked questions, and I'll answer just about any question. There's one question I won't answer, and that is a question that compares Israel to Nazi Germany. I simply won't. But and that was a fruitful night. I remember it very fondly. Tough, but fruitful.
I want to just acknowledge some of our viewers here. We have people watching from Brazil. We have an office in Brazil, by the way. Panama, Vienna, Austria, Panama City, Miami, Chicago, and of course, Tel Aviv. Just wanted to give them a shout out. Thank you very much for joining us. Can we talk for a moment about faculty? I know you have that experience as well. Having been faculty where at Yale? Was it Yale?
And Harvard. Okay. And Georgetown. Shouldn't leave Georgetown. Yes.
Okay. So what do you want to tell us about anti-Israel faculty and also pro-Israel faculty? Anything you want to talk about regarding faculty?
Well, faculty members, as all certainly all citizens, certainly on a university campus, are entitled to their views. As long as they don't bring those views into the classroom, as long as they certainly don't make those views part of their criteria for giving grades to students. And no one should dictate to any faculty member what his or her political views should be, as long as they remain within the realm of the acceptable. For example, if they are anti-Semitic views and they're expressed on a Facebook page or on an Instagram, then appropriate action should be taken, because that's a hate crime. But if someone is in favor of Israeli policies or against Israeli policies, they're certainly entitled to hold those views. They should keep those views out of the classroom.
Well, they should, but
they often don't.
They don't. Very often don't. And it's very problematic. It's very difficult for students because professors really kind of weave it in. They weave it into the subject, whether it's English or anthropology. It seems to be woven in. And then students feel very uncomfortable about speaking up. They feel that there'll be grade reprisals. It's a big problem. And now, since you and I have spoken last, Stand With Us has a legal division to help students and community members with these very issues, that when people cross the line, when they're anti-Semitic, when they, target a student because of their views, they have recourse. They have recourse, and we will help them.
It's been quite a while since I taught, because it preceded my time in Washington as an ambassador. But even back then, this is in the first decade of this century, it was extremely difficult on American campuses. I taught a very well-attended lecture class at Yale based on my book, Power, Faith, and Fantasy, America in the Middle East from 1776 to the present. and one of the most popular classes on campus. But the Middle East department would not let that class be taken for Middle Eastern credit. It could only be taken for American history credit. So here I am teaching American history at Yale, and Roz, I've never taken an American history class in my life. It was totally absurd. Now, the situation has deteriorated so vastly since then. So I now sit on a voluntary board of the Jewish Agency, along with Natan Sharansky, with Itzik Herzog, the director of the agency, and we oversee the shlichim and shlichot on the campuses, the emissaries from the state of Israel. And during our meetings, we often hear eyewitness testimony from American students, pro-Israel students, on American campuses. Roz, I don't know how they do it. I mentioned before my combat experiences. I don't know how these kids do it. They're some of the most courageous individuals I've ever encountered in my life. They receive endless threats, including physical death threats to themselves. And they don't give in, and they stand strong. And they are a source of inspiration for me, not the other way around. But I cannot imagine what it'd be like to be on an American campus today.
So it is difficult, and it's a different kind of combat.
It is.
And, students feeling marginalized or pushed out of social justice movements when they believe a certain way about Israel, they're labeled, Zionists and Zionist pigs. And, Zionist is not so bad, but, with the other words that come along with it, and marginalized. That's on the bad side. On the good side, they know that there's something wrong with that. And they understand that they have a network now where when we first began Stand With Us, there wasn't such a network. And it was really sad. And now, we're reaching 100,000 college students every year, 100,000 high school students every year. We've got a middle school curriculum. So things have really changed, and we have grown so much since you and I last spoke. And we're operating on 5 continents. And this very issue of professors bullying students in a classroom, or student groups that, think that you can only think one way. You can only be anti-Israel. And if you're pro-Israel, something's wrong with you. Well, okay. But if there's a network and there's a lot of people like me and I'm a Zionist, then I'm okay. I'm okay. I have a network. So it's tough, but there are remedies for it now. And we're happy to be part of it. We're happy to be part of the solution to the problem.
And I think, as so often the case in Jewish history, it's sort of a canary in the coal mine situation. That what begins with intolerance of Jews, of pro-Israel Jews on campuses, comes out of the campuses and can go in all sorts of invidious directions. And it becomes a general intolerance. It becomes a radicalization. And so much of what we're seeing in the United States, we see from a distance over here, of the end of discourse, the cancel cultures, began not so many years ago with virulent anti-Israel activity on campuses.
Yep. So we have questions from the audience. And by the way, if you have a question, please put it in the comments section. A question from Hannah from Seattle. Ambassador Oren, do you have any plans to return to politics?
Thank you, Hannah. I'm not running in the current election, but I never rule out the possibility of returning to serve my country in any number of capacities. Every time I've been called to the flag, whether it's riding on the horse on the Golan, or being in the army, or being in Washington, I've always answered that call.
Thank you. Juan from Madrid, do you have any words of advice for those of us who deal with anti-Israel sentiments at high school or university?
Well, it's interesting, Juan, you mentioned high school, because it's been my experience over the last decade that by the time young people reach university, it's often too late, that the anti-Israel indoctrination begins much, much earlier. I realized this in a very shocking way. I hosted a group of 16-year-old Americans from the Boston area who were part of an elite Jewish program. And they came to the Knesset to meet me. And their first question was, how can you serve in a government which denies the right to vote to half of its citizens? That was the first question. And I realized that and then it went downhill from there. And I realized that even 16-year-olds may be a little bit too late. So there's only one piece of advice, and that's the piece of advice I give not just to 16-year-olds or 26-year-olds, to anybody who's going to be involved in Israel advocacy. Educate yourself. Be better educated than anybody in the room. I know that when I go up in front of a university audience, there is nobody in that room who's going to know more than I am. Not because I'm a genius, but because I've taken the time to read all the books, to know all the facts, to know my adversary's narrative better than my adversary knows. And I can declare it better than they can. And I have always been firmly of the belief that when presented with all of the facts in the most objective way that facts can be presented, that a rational, clear-thinking person will come down on the side of the state of Israel. It's the way I wrote my history books. I didn't have to change any of the history. I just put out the facts. And anybody who knows nothing about the conflict and picks up one of these history books will say, oh, the state of Israel was right. Not perfect. But so get to that section. Learn everything. Be as educated as you possibly can.
Well, I think that is good advice for everybody, really. Everybody listening, all our community members, our high school students, and our college students. Learn, so that you're able to have a richer conversation about all these issues. We have a question from George in Paris. Since finishing your book on the 67 war, what historical lessons from then are relevant for Israel and the Middle East today?
Oh, many of them are still relevant. One is that the war that nobody expects to happen can and is likely to happen, because a small event on the border, an attack on the border, can begin to snowball or mushroom into a regional conflict that will profoundly change everything. And that can happen. That's the lesson of the 6-Day War. There's also a lesson, I think, that is a very deep lesson for those of us in the state of Israel, and it's one that we have to remind ourselves now, is at the end of the day, we have to stand on our own 2 feet. Yes, we've had important alliances, but George, you may remember on the eve of the 6-Day War, we had an alliance with France. And on the eve of the 6-Day War, France switched sides and abandoned us and began to support the Arabs. And we fought that war with French ammunition and French planes, a lot of French tanks, but without the support of France. And we won. And today we have an alliance, a very close alliance with the United States of America. But at the end of the day, we have to rely on ourselves. And I think that's a lesson that is not only derived from Israeli history, but from Jewish history. We have to rely on ourselves. The good news is today, Israel at 72 and almost 73 years old is a very strong country. We're not the same country we were in 1967. We're not the same country we were in 1973. We're one of the most powerful countries in the world. And yes, while we do appreciate and value our strategic alliance with the United States and our friends in Europe, at the end of the day, we have to defend ourselves.
So thank God for Israel. Thank God for you. You are an incredible representative for Israel and the Jewish people. You want to show us something?
I do. These are the pictures taken by my uncle outside of Dachau in 1945.
Wouldn't it have been amazing to have Israel during World War II?
If Israel had been World War II, there wouldn't have been a Holocaust.
Alas. I lost 80 relatives during the Holocaust. I'm a daughter of Holocaust survivors on both sides, and never met my family, 80 members. So I want to thank you, Michael, for joining us today, for always being such an inspiration, for always doing such incredible work for Israel and the Jewish people, and dedicating your life to the state of Israel. Thank you for joining us, really, from the bottom of my heart. And thank you from our collective Stand With Us international team of staff and volunteers and members. Thank you so much.
So, Roz, I want to thank you for everything you've done now for nearly 20 years, right, Roz? Everything you've done for Israel, for students in the United States, I think for the Jewish people, I think for the Western civilization in general, as you know, and for the people who are out there listening, hang in there. I know sometimes it's not easy, but know that you are defending Israel, you're defending Jewish history, and you are on the right side of that history. Be strong.
Thank you so much.
Well,
in 2 weeks, we have another terrific show for you. We'll be joined by Professor Judea Pearl, the father of Daniel Pearl, the journalist who was murdered in Pakistan by radical Islamists. Don't forget, we're live this time every second Sunday. If you've missed any of today's show or any of our other previous interviews with Ambassador Mark Regev, Colonel Richard Kemp, Ambassador Danny Danon, or many others, go to standwithus.tv, where you'll find a host of great video content available at no cost any time of day. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you for standing with us, and shalom from Stand With Us.